Thank you very much. I feel like a complete foreigner over here in the class of Armenians who speak French, when I'm neither Armenian nor do I speak French, but I can hardly understand. I can understand it, I would say. I can hardly speak it. Okay, so the year was 313 AD when Emperor Constantine signed the Edict of Milan. Thus, a new chapter in the history of Christianity started that day. And Christians were allowed to practice their faith freely starting that day. This event had its immediate repercussions on architecture, for until then it was impossible to discuss church architecture, as Christians were always on the run, and it would have been impossible for them to build churches or temples of worship because this would advertise their address. Such is the commonly established history. However, there is a footnote in this narrative that is often forgotten. Although it is a very important footnote, it's not a trivial footnote at all, but it is often forgotten. A decade plus before the conversion of Constantine, King Tiridates III of Armenia converted to Christianity. And not only he personally, but his people with him as well. Armenia did not undergo a systematic wave of persecution the way in other places in the Roman territories, the Roman Empire, it underwent. It did not have this systematic wave. But the first appearance of Christianity above ground was with the conversion of Emperor Tiridates in the year 301. So the beginning of church architecture in Armenia, actually, not just that, the beginning of church architecture worldwide could be discussed in Armenia before anywhere else. Usually, it is discussed in Byzantium, but there is a 10-decade difference, which means it must have begun in Armenia. Very little archaeological remains, actually no archaeological remains are from the early 4th century, so we don't really know if we have buildings from between the years 301 and 313, when the conversion of Constantine took place. But one can assume that church architecture actually begins in Armenia. So when one looks at the Armenian architecture in general, one is tempted to focus only on Armenian churches, and for good reasons. Because the Armenian churches are historic worldwide, and they also create the identity. We shall discuss a little bit further the identity. I shall give you a glimpse on Armenian architecture and its interpretation before we discuss the Armenian churches and their current status. Now, the following are some of the characteristics of Armenian architecture. An Armenian church could be spotted and identified literally from miles away because of its pointed domes. I wish to spend a couple of minutes with you discussing the Armenian dome, because of its imposing importance. These are two variations of an Armenian dome, this one and that. I'm going to discuss another subject before I come back to the domes so that we understand the notion of the domes. Many church buildings worldwide, historically, have adopted the notion of church as a boat. And this is based on many biblical passages, including the fact that Jesus walked on water, which is, of course, water is a symbol of evil. Jesus was on the board on deck with his disciples, fishing examples. The Russian cross, for example, has many interpretations. Of course, the most prominent interpretation is that it was because after the defeat of the Tartars at the hand of the Russians placed the crescent, which was the symbol of the Tartars. But that's one interpretation. There's another, less famous, but still an interpretation of the Russian cross. It is a sailboat. It is a sail on a boat. And the wind, being the Holy Spirit, will carry the direction of the boat. These are little elements from churches when you see a lantern or a lamp in the form of a boat, and early Christian graffiti taking the form of a boat. Jesus walking on water and saving Peter. And really, the images are endless. And that's another fragment of a piece. Okay, churches, such as this Romanesque church, are supposed to somehow resemble a boat, and quite often they do so. The picture is clearest, perhaps, when one compares it to Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark is, according to St. Peter in his letter, it is the boat of salvation, meaning the church. So whoever is on deck is saved, and whoever does not join them is in the risk of perishing or sinking. But when we go back to the the question of the Armenian churches, if we read what it says in Genesis, it refers to the mountains of Ararat. And on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, according to Genesis 8:4. And these are the mountains of Ararat. And quite often, there is the symbol of the dome of the Armenian church in reference to the mountains of Ararat. So there is no such urge in the mind of Armenian architects to connect the church to the boat, because they have the anchor place of the boat. So the mountains of Ararat are the connection place to the notion of a boat. And this is the location of Mount Ararat. And notice that usually in an Armenian church, you would have two domes parallel to the mountains of Ararat, as you can see, one larger than the other, one for the entrance and one for the central location of the church. I wonder if we can turn off some of the lights, if this is easy. But anyway. Okay, another point to look at, the question of the dome as a pointed arch, the question of the pointed dome versus the regular spherical dome. One may look at the difference between monism and monotheism. Of course, this could be discussed on many levels, including philosophy, but I'm interested in a particular viewpoint relating to religion. Monotheism, by monotheism, I obviously mean the three monotheistic religions, the mainstream monotheistic religions, because on the peripheries of monotheism, you might find touches of monism, but that's not my interest. The question of monotheism versus monism, in monotheism, there are two realities in the universe. There is the creator and the created. There is God and the universe. Time, man, or humanity, and creation are all in the same circle. So time has a beginning and an end. In the question of monism, there are no two realities. There's only one reality in the universe. It's that of the universe itself. It's the cosmos. It includes gods, time, etc. So time has no beginning and no end. The gods are just functioning in this universe. And of course, many would say that a monist approach would be that the real God is the universe itself, rather than an external force that creates the universe. And quite often, the question of a circle, dot and a circle, is taken to be the symbol of monism, because it goes back to the days of Pythagoras, when he indicates about the element being a circle within a wider circle, and usually in reference to the universe. Well, I'd rather skip some of these, but monism versus monotheism could very well be interpreted in architecture. So circular arches are very common among the Romans, who, of course, would far better qualify as monists than monotheists. And pointed arches, such as you would see in Gothic architecture, are a clear reflection of monotheism. Now, a fabulous example of monist architecture is the Pantheon. The word Pantheon would mean all gods. It's one dome covering all of the gods beneath it. It actually has 7 gods, but it's called Pantheon, referring to all the gods. It's the universe itself. So the dome itself is a reference to the universe. And early Christian architecture, such as the Byzantine architecture, was very much monistic in this approach and not monotheistic. Of course, a Byzantine would say otherwise. A Byzantine, well, like myself, I was introduced just now that I belong to the Greek Orthodox Church. Yes, I am a Byzantine myself. Byzantines would not say that this is monist. They would say this is monotheistic, because God has went down into the form of the dome. However, there is very little difference in form between, say, the Hagia Sophia and the Pantheon. They are both a dome on top of a fixed structure. But the difference would take place several centuries later in Europe, when the transformation goes from Romanesque into the Gothic architecture, from the circular arch into the pointed arch. So when we look into the Armenian dome, it is always pointed up. There isn't a phase in Armenian architecture where they, let's say, confused monism with monotheism. since the beginning of Armenian architecture, at least since the beginning that we know of, because there are some lost buildings from the earliest phases that we don't know much about. Since the beginning of Armenian architecture, it was clearly a monotheistic architecture, reflecting monotheism even in architecture. As such, it is much more advanced than its contemporary European architecture. So this was about the dome. Don't worry, I will not discuss all of the features in full detail as I have just discussed these. Another feature, well, let's perhaps look at this slide. Another feature is the sense of verticality. Quite often in Armenian churches, the church's height is greater than the church's length or width. There is the stress on verticality. Again, it's not unrelated to the previous point. It is a stress on upward allusion towards God. Among the other features, you usually have very thin openings, such as this example and that. And the stones are usually volcanic stones, especially in the areas around Ararat, usually black stone. At least some of the stones would be black, if not all of them. And they have a lot of ornament, well, not a lot, a frieze, a line of ornament, at least one line of ornament around it, such as these cases. Okay. Okay. So the reason why the church architecture is important is that it reflects the Armenian identity. Possibly, one could make an argument that it is second only to the Armenian language. Therefore, the focus on the characteristics of the Armenian architecture is not a purely architectural discourse, but perhaps equally so a discourse in collective identity. In other words, it is a discourse in sociology. So that was about the overview on the Armenian characteristics of the Armenian churches. In terms of the destruction or the current status of many of these churches, all evidence points out that during the past century, there were some efforts in carrying an architectural cleansing, if one may call it so, following the term of ethnic cleansing, just to continue the ethnic cleansing of 1915. A recently coined term that is being promoted is cultural genocide. And of course, one could view the architectural destruction under the banner of cultural genocide that is taking place. The massacre of the monuments of art was carried on during and after the genocide. Making an assessment of the losses of Armenian religious monuments during the years 1915 till 1922, one traveler wrote, more than 1,000 Armenian apostolic churches and monasteries were leveled to the ground. 1,000, that's a huge number. Plus, 691 other edifices were half destroyed. So we're now 1,600 plus. And then 1,727 religious and cultural possessions of the Armenian people were completely pillaged by Turks. The author then makes a detailed inventory of the cultural and artistic heritage relics that were that he could trace. So he would compile a list of them. I have some other statistics over here from a different source, which we might refer to. A survey, not in itself comprehensive, prepared in 1914 by the Armenian Patriarchate of Constantinople, listed 2,549 religious sites under its control, including more than 200 monasteries and 1,600 churches. Many were destroyed in the process of the genocide, but many more have since been vandalized. Those that escaped the destruction were vandalized later on, flattened or converted to mosques or barns. The monuments that survived did not have a fortunate fate. Those which were better preserved were transformed into municipal depots, electric stations, barns, homes for the Turkish peasants, and after some hasty additions, into mosques. Some of them became mosques. To travelers and tourists reaching these regions, the monuments are presented as the remains of authentic samples of Seljuk or Ottoman architecture. I had a colleague at the university in London. She was writing her PhD about Turkish museumology, and much of what she saw is that the tendency among the Turkish authorities to include things that were not part of their history under their own history. Her interest was more the Byzantine part, but this obviously could be widened and perhaps much easily widened to include the Armenian part of the heritage. The monuments of Van, according to the testimony of Lord Kinross, suffered new atrocities. In the 50s, another calamity befell the magnificent ensemble of churches in Khetkong, Khetsong, excuse me, when these were dynamited without any justification. It was a deliberate act of vandalism. The question that poses itself, were there any cases of reopening, fixing, doing anything with these? Yes, there were. Serb Khach, if I'm pronouncing it right, church had been damaged and closed down after the genocide, and no Christian services had been held there for about a century. The church was renovated by Turkish government in 2007 and turned into a museum with no cross placed on its dome, despite a promise given by the Turkish authorities to the Armenian community. A Christian service was eventually held in that church, but without a cross, causing much controversy and division among the Armenians. Even though Turkish authorities cited technical issues for not placing the cross, and they promised to overcome these technical issues, they never did. One of the most famous sites for destruction, unfortunately of Armenian destruction, is the site of Ani. Ani is a city situated today in the Turkish province of Kars between the 10th and the 11th century, namely between 961 and 1045. It was the capital of Bagratid, the Armenian kingdom that covered much of present-day Armenia and eastern Turkey. The possible name derives from the ancient goddess Anahit, quite a not so common but available name today. The city was known to have over 1,000 churches. It was often referred to as the city of 1,001 churches. Quite a number, 1,000 churches. Imagine, 1,001 churches. It sits on an altitude of 1,300 meters. Today, none of these churches is functioning. The few surviving buildings are half demolished, or less than half. These are the surviving buildings. Hundreds of Turkish nationalists traveled to the ruins of the 11th century Ani Cathedral on Friday, October 1st, to commemorate a Muslim victory over there, and held Islamic prayers in that location. Much could be said about the property. There were legal issues and illegal issues, or let me say legal decisions and illegal decisions. 4 more minutes. Okay. The legal process began with the cabinet decision to protect the Armenian properties left behind and allocate them temporarily to immigrants from the Balkans and the Caucasus. But the illegal decision, there was a secret word clearly, and I'm not so sure, I mean, I couldn't get hold of the document, but some sources suggest that it is documented that there was a secret word among the Turks at the time of the genocide, suggesting that these should be confiscated, liquidized, or distributed among the local governors. Okay. So many of the churches were converted into prisons. It is ironic that the place where the words of Jesus were read, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free," have converted illegally into places for prisoners. Much more could be said, but I don't want to overstay my welcome over here. So I could head towards the conclusion. That's the, okay. I just wish to make a parallel between an incident in Germany and that of Armenia. On the 9th of November 1989, the Berlin Wall was demolished by demonstrators. It was not an important building on the architectural level, obviously, but it was an exceedingly important monument in the history of the divided Germany, and on a global scale, it was an important monument in the history of the world, because the world was in the Cold War. And of course, after that, Germans could move freely between the two parts of Germany. Yet it so happened that November 9th was also the day of the Reichspogromnacht, if I'm pronouncing it right. That's the demolishing of the wall, and that's the right. So November 9th, 1938, it was the Nazi government that burned down Jewish shops and synagogues in Germany and encouraged the people to do the same. So when it was time to commemorate the fall, this historic fall of the Great Wall of Germany, no one thought of placing November 9 in order not to overwrite a local feast, or a local memory. That's why the day that they picked up was October 3rd, which is the official unification of the two Germanys. However, yeah, that's the parallel I'm trying to draw. But in Lebanon, supporters of Turkey not only refused to accept that one day per century, I'm not saying one day per year, one day per century to be taken as a national holiday. Not only did they refuse that, but they insisted on raising the Turkish flag on that day. I quote from what Sheikh Majid Darwish, the director of the Tripoli Mufti Malik Sha'ar's office says. He says, "We do not agree that there were massacres against the Armenians." Imagine if Germany not only chose November 9 as a commemoration of the fall of the Berlin Wall, but also raised the Nazi flags on that day and denied the Jewish Holocaust. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nasrallah.